So let's talk about some ruins and cover saves, firing lanes and move blocking, with a whole bunch of basic tactics tips to get the most out of the battlefield in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking battlefield terrain, and in this video I thought it would be good just to go through a whole bunch of different tips and tactics that might either lead to some in-game advantages via cunning use of ruins in the battlefield, or just at least knowing your options, being on the lookout for them, and for your opponent to do the same. Starting off, I feel like actually some of the most important things that you can get right about terrain is putting the right stuff on the battlefield and then being clear about exactly how those pieces are used once they're down. Perhaps the first thing to look out for when you're setting up for a game is making sure that the terrain is fair for both players, which usually means fairly even access to good line of sight blocking terrain pieces, so you don't just have one player being able to hide all their forces and another player sat in an open killing field of one sort or another. Tournament terrain packs often tend to have absolutely matching things, where the battlefields are all very symmetrical, which I don't think is very necessary at a casual level. There just maybe needs to be a bit of a semblance of balance, as sometimes seemingly small things like one player being able to hide their units on a midfield objective where the other player has no opportunity to could be a really big thing as the game goes on. In general, 10th edition tends to be best balanced with perhaps a surprising amount of terrain on the table for some people. This example from Games Workshop, if anything, I'd say is perhaps even a little on the light side. Some stuff to hide behind in the midfield, but also really big wide open firing lanes. Often for how much terrain you need on the board, it can be a little bit more than you might think, at least to have a good balance between range and melee armies. Obviously you certainly can play on more open boards, but just might be worth accounting for the fact that gunline armies are going to get a bit of an advantage there, so it might be a bit less good if you don't have two armies of relatively even composition. In general, at bare minimum though, I'd hope for at least some line of sight blocking terrain in both players' deployment zones and a fair few bits in the middle. If you are playing on some sort of asymmetric board, picking whether or not your attacker or defender could genuinely really quite matter a bit. Obviously you'd hope that one side didn't have a huge advantage, but I think certain armies could still certainly prefer different types of terrain to deploy on, so if you win the roll-off you might be able to eye up the different deployment zones and decide which one you want the best. I feel like in reality though, for more casual games, if you are playing on slightly asymmetrical terrain like that, I think it'd be kind of rare that I didn't just pick this side that I happen to be standing on. This one's not really as much of a thing in tournaments, as the board should normally be set up symmetrically between the two players. In that case it usually makes sense to let the other player be the defender, as they have to start deploying their units first, so you might get a little bit of an information advantage off them. As mentioned, when you do have terrain on the board, it's worth just having a quick talk through the terrain to make sure that both players are on board with how it's going to be used. Typically in 10th edition, the way that Games Workshop have written the rules, ruins tend to be by far the most impactful terrain pieces. Ideally you want to be on the same page about which bits are counting as ruins, so you don't have one player try and shoot through an area of terrain and the other player says that no, that should be line of sight blocking and things like that. And you might need a few rough and ready approaches depending on what sort of terrain you have, particularly say if your terrain pieces don't have bases, worth just being sure about which bits count for obscuring terrain and which bits don't. And when the footprint's a bit nebulous, are you just counting, say, everything around about a 1 inch under the ruin counts as the sort of area terrain, or are you counting everything within the big square of the ruin as the base? Both things can work and just need to be agreed on, really. When they do have bases, such as this one that sticks out the back quite a bit, rules as written they technically block line of sight if they're counted as the same terrain piece, so the Infernus Marine wouldn't be able to see the Orc Weird Boy in this example, or vice versa. Though sometimes with different terrain collections it just might not make sense if the ruin say has a ridiculously enormous base, and either way it could be worth confirming if you're either playing with someone new or on a board that you don't normally use. Then beyond that, perhaps the two biggest uses of terrain pieces are hiding units and gaining cover saves, both of which will be a lot more important if you're playing against an enemy army with massive firepower as opposed to something dedicated melee, so that might change the way that you play a bit as to how much you really play around with terrain. Aside from true line of sight blocking terrain, the main way that it gets blocked in 10th edition 40k is not being able to shoot all the way from one side of a ruin to the other side, so usually if you want to hide units they either need to be behind a completely solid wall where your opponent can't physically see them, or be literally behind the ruined terrain piece and have no part of any of the models venture into it, otherwise they'll be able to be seen from things on the other side. For example, the Space Marine tank can see the termagants in the ruin on the top picture, but not the ones on the other side of it. For the absolute most important units though, whether or not things can gain or not gain line of sight can be pretty big, and can often be planned around really quite well in the early stages of the game. For certain big devastating units, the game plan might be to stop them from seeing one of your important units next turn. So say the enemy had a Space Marine Repulsor Executioner that could kill a bunch of big stuff, and you have a scary gun tank. You might be able to see where the opponent can move that Repulsor Executioner, and make sure that it's got no way to get line of sight on your gun tank, while your unit maybe just toes out of cover and gets line of sight on something different. Obviously some things are going to get attacked by some things in the enemy army, but for the most important things it can be worth literally pre-measuring and seeing where line of sight can be obtained from. Say checking if their repulsor can go 10 inches round the cover, and then even if it goes maximally, there won't be any way to draw a bead on your important unit. And maybe doing a little bit of playing by intent as well, saying if I put my unit there, is there any way that your tank can draw a line of sight on it to make sure that your opponent's on board with the same conclusions that you're drawing. When you're deploying against a heavy gunline foe, in general deciding which units are going to be deploying out of line of sight is one of the biggest decisions. You might only have limited real estate for guarding certain units unless you have quite a small and elite army, and in general the aim of the game tends to be to hide as much of your army as possible so that if you go second your opponent isn't just going to step up and gun it all off the board. But if you go first the units still aren't going to be useless, you might be able to get some lines of sight and be able to move up the board anyway. But it just prevents you from straight up losing if you don't win the roll. In general, when hiding units, the things that have to be exposed might want to be the more expendable or more durable units out of your army, things that the opponent might not be able to destroy in one turn even if they focus them. And on the flip side, I feel like the thing that you want to avoid will be to be able to hide the vast majority of your army, but then just leave, say, one or two important things just hanging out in the open. So it still means that the opponent basically has the opportunity to use their full amount of firepower and just sink it all into one tough and important target, maybe destroy that one, and perhaps make a bunch of the work with hiding your units kind of meaningless if they've still been able to fire to good effect at one important thing. Obviously it's all going to depend a bit as to what sort of table you're playing on, and the composition of yours and your opponent's army. You're not always going to be able to hide everything perfectly, and sometimes it might be a bit less important. Otherwise, for line of sight blocking terrain, it can be big for causing problems on mid-board objectives. Typically for units either deploying in the mid-board or moving up there, prime real estate tends to be anything that's both out of line of sight and nosing onto an objective. Say for example these jump intercessors moving up here behind this solid ruin wall. It tends to be one of the best sort of places for infiltrating units to start out as well. It just means that basically if the opponent wants to take that objective, then they're probably in a bad position almost no matter what they do. If they have units with shooting damage, they're going to need to move all the way up rounds to get round to the corners of that ruin, potentially well past the objective, which there's a good chance they might just not have movement to do. If they're putting a big objective control unit onto the point to try and flip it to their control, then those are likely to be hanging out in the open and well exposed to return fire. And melee units might have a bit less problem and still be able to charge you in one way or another even if you're hiding behind ruins, but even then they might find the charges a bit more difficult and face counterattack as well. If you really are facing an army that's almost entirely melee units though, sometimes you might just literally want to do the absolute opposite. If the jump intercessors don't really have any guns to fear, they could just deploy right in the open on the mid-board objective. Then the idea is that when this World Eaters player charges them and kills all the jump intercessors, their 8-bound are then going to be sitting out completely in the open themselves, and hopefully easy prey to all your guns. If the jump intercessors started in cover, then the 8-bound charged and killed them. It might have meant that the 8-bound were then the unit in cover, which would cause more problems and make them harder to destroy on their counter-attack once your sacrificial objective holders were dead. Beyond objective things though, line of sight blocking ruins just tend to be good for staging and moving units up the board in safety before they get to strike. Some things in Warhammer 40K have got long range where they don't really need to worry about pushing up too much besides getting line of sight, but plenty of things do maximal damage either with close range shooting or in melee, and it means that jumping from cover to cover for them could be a good idea. Say for example we've got the World Eaters player who deploys their 8-bound here in their deployment zone, then they use their scout move behind this solid ruin wall, and then they've taken up a scary position in the bid board where they can be threatening to charge out of. From a scary forward position from that, it feels unlikely that the opponent's going to be able to keep their army out of melee and is going to have to make some tough choices. From a more grand strategy level of moving up behind terrain like that, you can often look at a board and determine what sort of powerful firing lanes there might be. Are there any particular places on the board that are unusually good places for your gunline units to set up? Or actually really quite tricky for your opponent to draw a bead on it due to multiple bits of terrain, and they might be kind of safe to set up in even if they feel like they're basically out in the open. It's pretty important for long range shooting units that might want to pay attention to places to set up, maybe being able to move down a movement corridor, and then if they reach one position on the board, they should be able to see a lot of enemy units that might otherwise be trying to hide. Sometimes the flanks can be quite good for that, so essentially move along the flanks and then hit the enemy army when they're trying to hide behind ruins that shield them from the front of your force. And more melee units or things that you just want to hide one way or the other might be able to find some blind spots where they basically can't be shot from anywhere turn 1. I feel like this one maybe tends to be a bit more the case on certain tournament boards where they're kind of set up with firing lanes in mind. Basically, with the different terrain pieces on the map, it might mean that if you move to be seeing around one terrain piece, another one might be in the way against a certain position, mainly aimed to balance out shooting units having to be a bit brave to push up to get lines of sight, rather than being able to see all the way into the majority of the opponent's deployment zone from their own one. With all the line of sight blocking ruin things, it's worth bearing in mind the units that interact unusually with that. Towering units get the special rule where if any part of them is towing into the base of a ruin, then they can just draw line of sight completely normally with true line of sight rules. So if the ruin's got loads of windows in it, they'll basically be able to see straight through it. And that means that something that you thought might have been providing a bit of cover could potentially just be completely worthless if the towering model can get into it. If you're using towering models like knights, for example, when moving up the board, it can be worth trying to measure to make sure that they can get into certain terrain pieces if they desperately want the option of being able to shoot things the other side of it, depending on where the opponent moves, thinking one turn ahead potentially. It's also worth recognising that things like other vehicles and monsters can't do this similar sort of thing. Perhaps one of the more commonly misplayed terrain things in 40k. If you've got a big gun tank or something, they can't just tow into a piece of terrain to be able to see out the other side of it. Otherwise, it's just worth remembering that towering units can certainly hide behind ruins and terrain pieces if they're fully outside of them. Sometimes that feels a bit weird, particularly if the ruins are kind of short, but they don't really treat them any differently now, and aircraft that aren't in hover mode can just ignore the ruin obscuring rules altogether, draw line of sight completely normally from true line of sight. So if your opponent's got a particularly scary shooting aircraft, there's a good chance you might not be able to hide from it very well when it turns up on turn 2 most likely, even if they maybe are a little bit of a rarity in the more competitive game besides just a few choices. Otherwise, the other big thing that tends to happen from terrain in 40k is cover, and it's particularly relevant to armies that have high saves and maybe less invulnerable saves and things. Maybe armies like Space Marines tending to get quite a lot out of it. In general, the +1 to save from cover usually tends to be important if you've got high saves, like say a 2+ armor save, and maybe even more so if you've got access to some sort of AP debuff option, say Space Marine Armor of Contempt or the Chaos Marine Renegade Raider stratagem. I feel like between those sort of things, it can transform a cover save from merely being pretty nice to have to being kind of game-changingly strong. Say for example a squad of Space Marine Centurions, they've got a 2+ save normally, but don't really have excessive durability in my opinion for the points cost despite that. If they move up into cover though, and they do have the budgets to use Armor of Contempt, they could be doing things like saving AP3 firepower on a 3+, turning them from a unit where that kind of shooting would rapidly make short work of them into something that's got pretty much no guarantee to take them down. Cover saves are just really easy to get in 10th edition, and usually only take a little bit of forethought to be able to make sure models can get them as they're moving up. Vehicles and monsters tend to have the easiest time of the bunch, just needing to make sure they obscure any small bit of the model behind some ruins or battlefield debris or something as they move up. Rules as written, it can be absolutely tiny things like say the tip of a Screamer Killer's talon or some spikes on a Chaos Predator. Obviously that all feels a bit weird and arbitrary, and I treat it as a bit of an abstraction. I like to think that the models as they move up the board might be taking opportunistic use of cover and not just literally just standing in place at the position where you put them. Titanic units should be even easier if anything, given that they've got enormous profiles, so at least some part of them should be obscured from the enemy trying to gun them down. And it's worth bearing in mind that literally any part of the model counts, even if it was literally just part of the model's base that was obscured. Again, that can provide a cover save rules as written, even if the entirety of the actual plastic miniature was on show. Otherwise, for cover saves to best gain advantages, it's usually just best to be very clear as to what things do get cover and what things don't, so you aren't missing opportunities to roll saves at higher values. If there's just one enemy model shooting at your unit, unless that model can fully see every part of your model, then you'll be able to get a cover save behind certain terrain pieces like ruin walls, woods or battlefield debris and things. So say for this example, he can fully see the Space Marine on the left, so that wouldn't get a cover save, and then he can only partially see the middle one and can't see the other one at all, so basically the two on the right would get cover saves against that Havoc's shooting. If that Havoc then fired and then caused 5 saves on the enemy, it should be slow rolled, usually against the models that are in cover. So basically take as many saves as you possibly can on the ones there before moving on to the ones at the lower save characteristic. Though in this case you probably need to take the saves, say 2 at a time on the Marines that do get cover, just in case they both die to the first attack, and then you have to roll the subsequent saves on the lower value. Against enemy multi-model unit shooting, it's even easier to get cover. This time cover is checked for the entire shooting unit just on the basis of essentially the worst models. Each of the Space Marines gains cover if even one of the models won't be able to see them fully, so the positioning of the Havoc on the right means that even the Space Marine on the left of the unit will be able to get a cover save against the entire Havoc's unit shooting. That also works if there's just one model hanging back, say there's one Havoc on the other side of a wall that isn't shooting, and then all the others are opening fire and they've just got absolutely plain sight. The fact that one's behind the wall technically means that the entire Space Marine unit gets cover, even if this one feels very unintuitive to me. That's the rules for models being partially or fully obscured, but you can also get cover from area terrain as well. For this one though, you only get the +1 to your armor save if the models are entirely within the footprint of the area terrain. They can't just be partially in, like say the jump intercessor here. The one that's actually within the footprint of the ruin will get a +1 to a saving throw. The one that's only partially within the footprint of the area terrain won't be able to, as he doesn't satisfy the criteria and isn't obscured by any intervening terrain in any way. Again, could be worth thinking about for certain models if they do absolutely need a cover save against one thing or another, and there isn't actually going to be any intervening terrain. Terrain features can also be a big deal for move blocking things. Generally only a few unit classes like infantry and beasts can go through ruin walls and things, otherwise things like mounted units and monsters and vehicles need to go around, and that means that they might be able to only go through certain movement lanes that's really possible to bung up with even just one model in the way. For example, this Gorkanaut wants to get through and stomp his way towards the rest of the Space Marine army, but because there's a single lone intercessor in the midst of those ruins, it's not really going to be going very far this turn. As the Gorkanaut can't go into engagement range with him, he basically just needs to stomp up to the intercessor and then lightly prepare a charge. And after that's done, at the very end of the turn, even including the charge move, is probably not going to have been able to force his base very far past the intercessor's actual position at all. And that could be a very worthwhile trade if you've lost a model or two, or a small sacrificial unit, and you've kept a big points cost enemy unit essentially out of the fight for one more turn. This tends to be easier to do with big slow melee related things that need to go moving around terrain, and can sometimes be a pretty punishing way to hold up an enemy army. One kind of rarely used rule in the terrain set is the Plunging Fire one. This one's basically a small reward for setting up shooting units in the top bits of ruins, and it only comes into effect if the model is 6 inches or more vertically from ground level. If it is, then they basically get an extra pip of AP on their guns if the target they're shooting at is at ground level. This one kind of depends on the battlefield that you're playing on. There might not be many or any ruins that satisfy that, but if you do go for it, then it's best for long-range dedicated firepower units where the AP will actually matter against their targets. And that depends on the guns that you're using, plus also the opponent's army. Maybe against things like Space Marines with access to Armour of Contempt, it could genuinely matter a bit. Even if you can potentially deploy up there to make use of it though, it's not always necessarily the best idea. If you're greater than 6 inches from the floor, then it means that you either need to advance or move more than one turn if you just want to reach ground level. So essentially a unit's pretty much completely stuck in place for a while, and that could have a few disadvantages. If a whole load of both units on both sides get killed, then anything that you put up at the top of ruins might really struggle to get to objectives if they need to step up and get into the fight. You might struggle to be able to hide those units, as they might be sat up on a big balcony basically right out in the open. And if there happens to be great targets in the enemy army that they really wanted to shoot, but their very limited position doesn't actually gain line of sight to them because of other bits of terrain, they're not going to be able to move very easily to get that. So you really want the position for them to set up to have really quite a commanding view of the battlefield and not be too hemmed in by other line of sight blocking terrain bits. Between all that, particularly for say more things like small arms, I'd kind of resist the temptation to make use of it too much. But sometimes could be the right decision if you've got good infantry firepower units with long range and are going to be against an army where the AP difference is really going to matter. I feel like that wouldn't be every game though. In general, terrain pieces tend to be a bit more effective against scoppering enemy shooting than melee, but they definitely can also have an impact there as well, particularly for things that can't just go through the ruin walls. If your unit drops further back behind a wall, then they might have a really quite long charge to make. Maybe not the single best example for a model, but this Chaos Predator, for example, will need to get its back corner all the way to the tip of that ruin wall before it starts to move out again. it might have to use up most of its characteristic just to skirt the ruin, even if it really hasn't moved all that far as the crow flies. Sometimes you might just have to make sure that the opponent is measuring this one carefully. I feel like even amongst experienced players, there can be a bit of temptation just to use a bit of an optimistic eye and cut the corner slightly. There is also that slightly janky rules interaction, where you can basically take up position in ruins and make charges significantly harder to do, which on the face of it I don't think it sounds too terrible from a lore sort of standpoint, given that I'd imagine it would be harder to charge infantry that have lined up properly in a fortified building or something. But on the other hand, the actual mechanics of it are more due to where you can physically place models, which does make it feel a bit unintentional and weird. Basically, the idea is that if you have a line of, say, infantry models just behind a ruined wall, you position them so they're just exactly 1 inch away from the wall, which means that you can never be in engagement range with them if you're outside of it. But also, if you're leaving a narrow gap that is around about 1 inch, plenty of units with bigger bases just aren't going to be able to physically fit on the other side of that wall. So say, for example, this Terminator wouldn't be able to charge into the position with the red X. If he ends his charge outside of the wall, then he's not in engagement range, and there's physically not enough room for his model inside the wall, so basically he just can't go there at all. It means that his charge roll would have to be a fair bit longer, going all the way down to the end of either the unit or the ruin. So in this case, he basically needs to make a big 8-inch charge move as opposed to a 5-inch one. And that could be a really big deal if he winds up failing the charge as a result. This one tends to be really quite commonly used in tournament play that doesn't have some sort of special rule that tries to fix it. I believe WTC rules kind of forbid this with a slightly arcane system of counters and things, and the upshot is just basically don't try and do this. And outside of tournaments and things, I feel like the perception is that it's just a bit gamey, and maybe more falls under rules abuse that Games Workshop haven't found a way to fix. For tournaments, just going by Games Workshop's Pariah Nexus pack though, they basically FAQ'd this to say that this was allowed, and it's at least fairly common play in tournaments to say that this unit is taking up position at just 1 inch behind the walls, and players just know that they have to go around. You could also do this to sort of weirdly limit damage in charges as well. Potentially have one model that's within 1 inch of the walls so that a charge could succeed, but then basically it's unlikely that the enemy is going to be able to get any more than one model within engagement range. In this case, the Terminator squad would only be able to get the single Terminator into an engagement range and then attack the Gretchen. The others wouldn't be able to, as they're not within base of base or within 1 inch, means that you could kind of strangely have a charge that deals almost no damage, and the unit that's behind the walls could remain fairly unscathed. Otherwise though, when your units are just fighting each other in the mid-board, there's plenty of ways that they can offer different advantages. Blocking Overwatch could be a big one. Say for example, if the Sisters Repentia want to charge this Land Raider Redeemer, they're probably best off to do so from behind the ruined walls, as if they just move out into the open, they're probably going to get torched by those Flamestorm cannons. If they're out of line of sight now, then the Redeemer won't have the opportunity to Flamestorm them, as it can't see them at the start of the charge move, and while it is allowed to Overwatch at the end of the charge move, the big guns never tire rule doesn't function in the enemy charge range, so it can't shoot things in melee with it, so it's still not going to be able to fire then. Against things with truly massive Overwatch, it can well be worth having a longer charge and charging from behind walls, if it's going to guarantee that the unit doesn't just get insta-killed with Overwatch. For countering another stratagem, you could potentially help to stop precision from going off. Say for example, if you've got a big infantry squad with one important but easy to kill attached character, say a bunch of boys with a pain boy. If you keep the pain boy out of line of sight, then the enemy wouldn't be able to use precision to shoot him down with sniper rifles, and to keep him safe from melee things as well, such as Epic Challenge with the Chaos Lord here. That matters more for some units than others, but is particularly big for the Orcs here, given that their defense gets so much worse if the pain boy gets slain, but the pain boy himself isn't really too hard to kill. Another thing that you could do, even if you can't hide an entire unit, is to make sure that you have some of your models out of line of sight, and that could give you some big options with casualty removal. Say for example here we have a great big mob of Orcs. When the Havoc shoots, you could either choose to take it on the Orcs that are within the ruined walls, as they'd be getting cover saves against them, or you could choose to take it on the Orcs that are outside the ruined walls and hope that the Chaos player kills enough of them that the rest of the squad won't be visible anymore. If the Havocs cause a whole bunch of casualties and kill the ones that are out the front, then the rest of the Chaos gun line might be entirely unable to see the other half of the boys' squad, and that might wind up being the best outcome for them. It should hopefully mean that there's a good chance that at least some of the squad survives, unless they take an absolutely massive burst of firepower from something that just kills the entire mob outright in one round of shooting. Finally, for ruined wall shenanigans, They can also be quite big for things like transport disembarking or reactive movers as well. They tend to be the best friends of things like the Space Marine Combi Weapon Lieutenant, the lone operative that could be standing out in the open or an objective. When the enemy moves up to claim that objective and hopefully kill the lieutenant, he can use his reactive move to be able to just ghost behind the ruin walls, and then the unit that's moved up won't be able to shoot him dead. Depending on the enemy unit, it's often possible just to guarantee that no matter where they go, that your unit might be safe. If, say, the hammerhead moved all the way down to the end of the ruin, it could still be possible for the lieutenant just to move behind the ruin walls up to the north, so it could be hard to take him down without multiple units doing some kind of pincer movement. The same could be kind of true of transports as well. Say if you have a transport vehicle parked on this objective and then the enemy shoots it dead, being parked up next to a ruined wall means that the transport occupants might just be able to get out on the other side, and while the transport's dead, he can now no longer attack the occupants, and they can either sit on the objective or be ready to counter-attack next turn, or both. In any case though, I'll leave that there for this one. Hopefully that's given a few bits of inspiration as to how to use terrain for advantage in 40k, and let me know any other terrain tips and tricks down in the comments below, for some of the options I've no doubt glossed over a bit. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.